Welcome to Equipping Leaders, a podcast where I share and discuss resources, tools, and information to equip leaders to build creative, cohesive teams through culture and leader development. Welcome to the Equipping Leaders podcast. I am your host, Natasha, and in this last episode of 2021, I am going to share my top 10 leadership books of the year. I am an avid reader, as many of you know, and many of the books that I read are leadership focused. So while this year I did read a total of 351 books, 110 of them were leadership focused. In jumping in to share my top 10 leadership books of 2021, I also want to acknowledge that some of these books were published this year, but others were not. This just happens to be the year that I read them. Also, they are in no particular order. It was hard to even choose a top 10, so they're in no particular order. First, I have Impact Players, How to Take the Lead, Play Bigger, and Multiply Your Impact by Liz Wiseman. I am a huge fan of Liz Wiseman. In the past, her work included Rookie Smarts and Multipliers, and in this book, Liz shares research that she did around team members who have the greatest impact in organizations, even if they are not the person out front or the person in charge. The concept of impact players is a mindset, not an individual, and we may ebb and flow into and out of this mindset throughout our career. Wiseman also identified 5 key differences of impact players, which are that they do the job that's needed, they step up into leadership, and then they can step back down out of it. They finish stronger, they ask questions and make adjustments, and they make work light. One of my biggest takeaways was that impact players view everyday challenges not as a hindrance to or a distraction from their job, but as a natural, normal part of their job. Next, I have Think Again, The Power of Knowing What You Don't Know by Adam Grant. This is another thought leader who I greatly respect because of the immense research that goes into every one of his books. In this book, he talks about how we are conditioned to think, both from internal and external resources, and how we can gain more perspective and insight when we just challenge ourselves to rethink. There are great examples of how it is beneficial to relearn how to think, especially because we are conditioned to think in these 3 basic mindsets. So we're either thinking in the mindset of the preacher, the prosecutor, or the politician. My biggest takeaway from this book was the idea that when it comes to our own knowledge and opinions, we favor feeling right over being right. I had the opportunity to watch John Maxwell's virtual event, Live to Lead 2021, and the next 2 books on my list are authors who spoke at that conference. First, Tim Elmore, who was such an engaging and really funny speaker. It was his great humor and, of course, his great thoughts that compelled me to purchase his book. His book is The 8 Paradoxes of Great Leadership, Embracing the Conflicting Demands of Today's Workplace. In this book, he talks about the individuals who make up today's workforce and how they are showing up in the workplace. They're bringing different things and having different expectations of the workplace. Then he goes into the 8 paradoxes, and these are lines that leadership must know how to navigate to be successful. So one example is that a leader must balance confidence and humility. And he retells the story of Bob Iger and his approach in acquiring Pixar. He aligns each paradox with a different leader from history and how they manage the paradox in their time. My biggest takeaway from this book was the concept that you should argue as if you believe you're right, but listen as if you believe you're wrong. The other Live to Lead 2021 speaker was Joel Manby, who wrote a book called Love Works, 7 Timeless Principles for Today's Leaders. I was immediately drawn to this book because I'm always trying to figure out how to incorporate the concept of love in the workplace. There are so many great concepts in this book and new perspectives on how to really bring love in the workplace. I know that on the surface, this concept may sound a little hippie, but I promise that this book makes it tangible, appropriate, and easy to view the workplace through this lens. My biggest takeaway from this book was that it's powerful to treat someone with love, regardless of how you feel about them. While we can all get on board with that intellectually, because of course we should treat people like professionals, we're in the workplace, regardless of our feelings. But there's something about the way and the timing of how it's presented in this book that really changed how I put that into practice. I have a phenomenal mentor, and she recommended the book Fierce Conversations, Achieving Success at Work and in Life, One Conversation at a Time by Susan Scott. My favorite topic to talk about with leaders is difficult interactions, courageous conversations, and crucial conversations. Basically anything that's uncomfortable and brings up a lot of emotions for everyone involved. I appreciated the idea of conversations being fierce. Susan Scott identified 4 objectives of fierce conversation, which are to interrogate reality, provoke learning, tackle our toughest challenges, and enrich relationships. There are so many useful tips and experiences throughout this book. The 2 things that stood out to me the most are the idea that the conversation is the relationship. Every time we interact and talk with someone, we are building this relationship, and those fierce interactions make that relationship stronger. And the more fierce it is, the more trust that's needed and the more trust that is built. The other thing that stood out to me was the powerful question that the author said she asks people, which is, what are you pretending not to know? I have not only found this question to be impactful in conversations with others, but very insightful when I am doing self-reflection. I love public speaking and helping others gain confidence in public speaking. And the book TEDTalk, the official TED Guide to Public Speaking by Chris Anderson, who is the CEO of TED, is essentially a narrative textbook of how to be a great speaker. There's so many actionable tips that I was able to use immediately that had a positive impact on my public speaking and facilitation. Whether you're trying to drive home a point that is issue-based or idea-based, there are tools for speaking that I also found to be great insights for leadership conversations. You don't always have to be standing in front of a room of people to make an impact. You could absolutely use the tools and idea in this book to gain more influence and present your ideas in a more fulfilling way. I want to give you my biggest takeaway from this book, but there are so many. I highly recommend this book for anyone who is interested in not only increasing their leadership skills, but also their confidence and speaking skills. I'm in a leadership group that started discussing the accountability dial, and at the time I was not familiar with what that meant. I was directed to the book Good Authority, How to Become the Leader Your Team is Waiting For by Jonathan Raymond, which talks about accountability from a neutral perspective. We tend to view accountability as a sort of gotcha system, when in reality it can be either positive or negative. The accountability dial is a 5-step dial that empowers leaders to engage with their employees in a way that is kind, fact-based, and continues to escalate only when necessary or appropriate. There are a lot of great concepts and ideas throughout this book as well, and I found that I actually use the accountability dial, whether in execution or in concept, at least once a week. In 2021, I also transitioned from one career to another, a completely different one, and I became very interested in the balance of being a specialist or a generalist, and I came across the book Range, Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World by David Epstein. This book does highlight the benefit of both generalists and specialists and how to navigate the world as a generalist. I really appreciated how this book highlighted the empowerment that being a generalist brings to multiple aspects of your career journey, as individual contributors and as leaders. Next, I have Change Enthusiasm, How to Harness the Power of Emotion for Leadership and Success by Cassandra Worthy, which I actually came across while scrolling through LinkedIn. I am always drawn to different perspectives on change management, especially those that are focused on the humans within that change cycle. And this book sounded great. And spoiler alert, it was. I could feel Cassandra Worthy's enthusiasm just coming off the page, and her story of leading change initiatives and the places she identified that leaders could acknowledge and offer more emotions was very insightful. I also really loved that there were exercises throughout the book, each of which was not only insightful, but really fun to work on. Finally, I have Great Mondays, How to Design a Company Culture Employees Love by Josh Levine. This book was part of an online book club that I'm involved in, and it was such a fun and inspiring read. There were a lot of topical visuals, which helped to really break up the concepts and make them memorable. I appreciated that Josh Levine provided ways for anyone in an organization to impact the culture and make the workplace better. It's a team effort, and we can all hold each other accountable. So those are my top 10 leadership books of 2021. I do already have some books sitting on my shelves waiting to be read in 2022, and I've curated these books from some of my favorite book recommendation resources. Seasonally or quarterly, Adam Grant releases his list of anticipated books, which you can find on his social media or if you subscribe to his free newsletter. The Coaching for Leaders podcast with Dave Sahoviak, which has some phenomenal thought leaders, and I usually order their book as I'm listening to the episode. Some advice I like to give people when they're trying to parse through the millions of leadership books available to be read is to pick a book that sounds interesting to you. Trying to read a book that is too dense or too concept heavy when you have limited time is not beneficial to anyone. I absolutely will sometimes pick up a book and just kind of leaf through it, whether I've purchased this book or it's at the library. And in looking through it, I can tell that right now I don't have the mental or emotional capacity to invest in the type of book that it is. So I'll set that one aside. Maybe I'll come back to it later, maybe not. But I will read books that are interesting to me at the time. I also like to consider a few questions. So before I start reading a book, I ask myself, why am I reading this? While I'm reading the book, and then when I finish the book, I'll ask, how can I use this and who can benefit from this? And this can be for a certain part of the book or for the book as a whole. These questions help me use the concepts quickly so that I remember more of the content from the book. Because when you start to use it and actually put it into practice, you help cement that in your memory a little bit better. If you would like to hear some tips and ideas on reading more books and absorbing more content, I did a podcast episode titled Read More and Retain It in Season 1. I will end this episode and the final episode of 2021 with a quote from Harry S. Truman, one that I know many of us have heard before, and it is, "Not all readers are leaders, but all leaders are readers." Thank you for listening to this episode of Equipping Leaders. This season, there is an associated blog for each podcast episode, which can be found on my website, natashacheyenne.com, under Leadership Journal. My website also features other leadership development content, such as frameworks, book recommendations, a weekly newsletter, and other downloadable content. You can also follow me on Instagram at novel_Natasha and on Twitter and Facebook at Natasha Cheyenne. Join me next week for another episode.